So hello and welcome. I am Nora Sada from Building Bridges, and today we are hosting a new discussion on the social dimension of ESG. Patricia Richter, who is Senior Technical Officer for Social Finance at ILO, Martijn Oosterwoud, ESG Specialist at UBS, Belinda, ESG Investment Director at Capital Group, and Juan Salazar, Senior Engagement Specialist at Pictet. So before giving the floor to our moderator today, Dorothée Baumann-Pauly, who is also the director at the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, I just wanted to remind everyone that our 2022 edition of Building Bridges will take place on October 3 to 6 in Geneva, and it will feature a high-level summit as well as 65 events on sustainable finance. So we really look forward to welcoming you in Geneva this October. And on September 29th, we will also host the final webinar of this webinar series that will focus on financing the sector and clean energy system. So don't hesitate to download our mobile app or to check our website for all our upcoming events. So I am now giving the floor to Dorothée. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for kicking us off. It's my great pleasure to facilitate this session. Given my background with a focus on business and human rights, I, of course, have an outsized interest in the S in ESG, the S that is supposed to capture human rights performance of companies. And from research that I conducted with my colleagues at NYU Stern in 2017, we know that we're not quite there yet. I'm happy to provide access to this information in the chat. Today, we'll discuss the challenges and the potential of the S in ESG. Sustainability, typically, also in the finance context, is still defined as mostly of environmental concern. The S is often the stepchild in this conversation, and I'm thrilled that at Building Bridges this year, the S is gaining prominence through this warm-up event and also through a session that I'll be hosting on October 5 during the Building Bridges Week, with a particular focus on how to measure the S in ESG. So you've heard I'm here today with 4 true experts on ESG. These experts, it's their day job to figure out the S in ESG. So I'm looking forward to hearing from them how they're addressing the data challenges with the S. And I want to start out with a provocation. Some of you may have seen the series published by The Economist entitled Measure Less But Better, referring to the many issues with ESG to date, basically making the argument, instead of struggling to figure out the S and the G, we should ditch the S and the G and focus exclusively on the E, the environmental dimension. And even on the E, we should focus just on one metric, namely greenhouse gas emissions. So I want to start out with a lightning round with our experts to see, have we all come to the right table today? Why does the S matter from your perspective? We have 3 representatives from companies and Patricia Richter from the ILO. I'll start with you, Patricia. Why does the S matter? Why did we have this conversation today?
Thanks, Dorothée, and for getting me started here. So why does this S matter? I mean, the S, social, society, and what is this? This is all of us here in this webinar. This is our families at home. This is all the people around us. And it's a little bit different, unlike financial calculations, where we can have a little loss here and a little gain there. And on average, if we have a positive gain, kind of all is fine. But we can't do this for the S, because we cannot average out a fatal accident here with some income gain over there. As a society, that doesn't work. And that is why the S matters.
Thank you, Patricia. Let's move on to Juan.
Thank you. For us, I mean, we fundamentally believe that how companies manage stakeholder relationships links to value, and not only economic value, but societal value and ultimately environmental value, if I may say so. So, for us, assessing these practices across our holdings, it's really critical to our investment decision-making process in the way that it'll give us insights into the practices companies are following, and over time, these companies or the companies that do right, let me rephrase that have a robust approach to managing these risks and opportunities from a wide range of social issues may be poised to outperform.
Thanks, great. Martijn, over to you.
Yes, thanks. It's such a weird question. I don't even know where to start. But I guess, social changes, whatever happens in the world, be it an aging population, be it urbanization, be it changing views and regulatory changes in the way we treat equality and inclusiveness, all have a direct impact on the way a company needs to operate, as well as on the business models of these companies, right? The products and services that they're trying to sell. So not taking that into account for us as a investment manager, as a wealth manager, as an investment bank would simply be grossly negligent and I think rather stupid. So I think the economists missed the point completely.
Thank you, Martijn. That's a strong statement. I'd love to talk to Belinda again as well, but I'm not sure if she's here with us. She had connection issues and I cannot see her currently on my screen, but if you can hear us, Belinda, are you here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, you can't see me, but glad that you can finally hear me.
No problem.
Thank you. Great to be part of this discussion. I think, S matters because if I break it down in really simple terms, S is really about people. So employees, customers, communities, and they all matter. So whether it's employee well-being, something like diversity, equity, inclusion, which is increasingly important in the focus, it could be consumer welfare, human rights, access and affordability, social health and nutrition. It's such a broad range of topics, and I think these are all super important topics. So if you think about it in sort of a really simple lens, of those topics that it covers, and then you add the investment lens, where a lot of these things are really important and material for investments, I think it's pretty clear that the S does matter. It's not just about the E. And one other point, I think we did our most recent global ESG study and published the results earlier this year, and actually sort of 4 in 10 investors expressed concern that social issues are actually being overlooked in favor of climate issues. So I think there is that recognition that it's not just about the E, but we need to think about everything together.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Belinda. I think we should send the recording of the session to The Economist. Compelling analysis, but our experts agree the conclusion is wrong. We need to figure out the S. I think this was a great scene setter. Let's now move on to Patricia again. I'd love to know from her in what role the pandemic played in advancing the interest in S and the need to figure out the S from your perspective as an economist who also studies Africa and Asia. I'm sure you have examples to share that further highlight why the S is so relevant. Before you start speaking, Patricia, I would love to remind the audience of engaging with us. This is supposed to be an interactive conversation, so you can use the chat and the Q&A buttons to send us your questions and comments. Patricia, over to you.
Thanks, Dorothée. I am really putting on my full ILO hat now. I work in social finance, so I typically work with the financial sector. But of course, my colleagues who are the labor experts, the labor economists, they have produced statistics. And they have done this throughout the pandemic. And I actually think they have done quite an extraordinary job there, also informing the rest of the world, what is happening, that we have some data at hand that we can use to maneuver through this pandemic. And what we saw, I mean, 2020 was kind of really that year. And looking at the statistics, the global working hours that were lost was 8.8%. So, I mean, this number might sound a bit funny, but when you translate it, and when you translate it into full-time employment, that was 255 million full-time jobs. And this is a number that we shouldn't take lightly. It's a number, yes, but what does it mean? Losing a job? It means losing income. It means losing income for a family. It often goes along losing safety nets like social protection, having an impact on health. So it goes a little bit further. So this is really at the heights of the pandemic, what we saw, going along with also losing skills. People were laid off. People reduced working hours. The other element that I wanted to mention is we saw that the pandemic had a stronger effect on women, especially on women in the informal sector. And why is this so? Because women, if they are in the workforce, and maybe we are not taking Dorothée, Belinda, and me as an example here, but looking at the majority of the women out there, they work maybe part-time in the informal sector or in sectors that were really prone to the pandemic, the services sectors, and they more of them lost jobs compared to men. In the recovery, we see that actually the recovery for men in the workforce is faster than for women. So starting off already lower, now the recovery is slower. So it's really giving us some food for thought here. So that was on the statistics. If you allow me, I want to add a bit more, not really government interventions. We have all seen this and fine, but what else have we actually seen in the businesses? How have they managed? And there are two things that we saw also through our support to the financial sector that invests in the real economy. So we saw on the one hand on substance, those companies that did have business continuity plans in place, they could just open the drawer and they could run. That was a success factor. We saw wherever EHS committees were there, the companies were immediately able to pick up the health effects and put in place measures. The same for community outreach plans. All of this played into the companies immediately being able to act, and it really helped them not to suffer as much as others. Of course, they were affected. That's on the substance. On the processes, and I do want to make this point, the companies we saw that had established dialogue processes in place, it simply allowed them to speak, to communicate, to pick up fears of employees, of communities surrounding them, and help them also get acceptance for measures that just needed to be installed, and have this continuous dialogue. Also, when measures were installed that did not work, having these feedback loops. So it's on the one hand the substance that company had in place, but also these processes, and especially this dialogue. So perhaps I stop there. There's some lessons from the pandemic.
Thank you, Patricia. These are great insights, and I'd love to get a reaction from Juan, because he's been nodding along so vigorously. I want to know if these good practices have found its way into your investment decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really agree with what Patricia was talking about. In the sense that companies that had the governance frameworks in place were able to respond more effectively to the impacts of the pandemic. And for us, it was really important to understand how they responded to the pandemic itself, because that gave us an indication of how they would respond to other challenging environments, which there are more of those coming our way. So to the extent that we can assess and understand how companies are prepared to face those challenges, so that information will feed into our company analysis and entire investment decision process. It is really unfortunate that it took a global pandemic for, to amplify and accelerate the push of social issues as an economic reality. It shouldn't have happened that way, but it did. So, we've seen an evolution of the S from a sort of values, moral question into one that is a material business question. And we've known that for a long time, and all of us here in this panel have known that for a long time, but unfortunately, the market hasn't really sort of embraced that.
Okay. Thank you, Juan. Martijn or Belinda, would you like to add to Juan's reaction?
No, but I think what is important, what Juan mentioned, is that corporates are part of the social fabric that we have. We can't do without, and I think that became especially clear. And I think it's very well understood that corporates have a role to play, and to some extent are also dependent on society to make sure that they can deliver the products and services and exist in the way that they do. And that's in a way a positive element in this horrible crisis that caused a lot of downside to a lot of people. And I think on the investment side, that has further helped people make aware of the importance of the S. So it's positive that there is something coming out of it, and that we hopefully learn something for the longer term.
Thanks. Let's move on. I'd love to still talk about some of the tensions that do exist between the E and the S. While around this virtual table, we all agree that the S matters, and the S matters more than ever after the tragic experience of the pandemic, and the firms here are concerned about equitable recovery. The reality still is that the E and the S are in tension. I've done in-depth research on the battery supply chain with a focus on cobalt, and I know that as we want to accelerate electric mobility, we need to increase cobalt mining, and cobalt comes predominantly from the Democratic Republic in the Congo, where there are many human rights challenges from mine safety issues and child labor, and they need to be managed in parallel. Yet the investment decisions don't always fully acknowledge the human rights dimension of, for example, renewable energies. There are land rights issues with wind parks. There are, the tech firms often excel on the E, but they have abysmal working conditions. And so there are tensions between the E and the S, and I'd love to hear from you, how are you dealing with this tension? And I would like to know, do we need more aggressive screening to make sure that ESG funds exclude the S laggards, so you cannot compensate the S with great performance on the E? Or is it a better strategy to disaggregate the E and the S? What's your opinion on this? Maybe I try Belinda first, because she didn't speak in the previous round.
Thank you, Dorothée. I think it's important to recognize that there is no perfectly good or perfectly bad company. So everything is naturally going to be a balance. I think you need to take a holistic approach. So rather than focusing on individual, environmental, or social issues in isolation. So, for example, we can't focus on climate change without thinking about the S. Yes, of course, we need to decarbonize the global economy, but we need to ensure that there's a just transition, and that's something that it's not always sort of spoken about. We do think about the impact on local communities, what this means in terms of jobs and livelihoods. And similarly, if we were to flip that around and start with, we think about the S, the world's growing population, so estimated to be around 10 billion by 2050. We're going to need to get more food to feed all of those people. But we can't just focus on this in a vacuum without considering the impacts that this will have on the environment. So there'll be greenhouse gas emissions, land use, the impacts of that on global temperature rises. If we think about today, agriculture, forestry, land use change accounts for 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions already. And then we've sort of got a couple of billion extra people that we're going to add to that population. So we need to think about how we're going to feed the growing population in a sustainable way. And, that's just one example of how I think where we need to think about everything collectively, holistically, and try and solve for everything, not just one thing, because there will be consequences and impacts on other areas as well.
Thanks, Belinda. Martijn, do you want to contribute how UBS is dealing with this potential tension? And I have a specific sub-question here. Companies are now submitting so-called transition reports to ESG teams. And the ones that I've seen, they're all talking about environmental risks, essentially overlooking the human rights risks that often come in parallel. For example, they highlight their future strategy to transition to electric mobility, yet they're not talking about the human rights risks in the Congo. Are you systematically pointing that out to the companies?
Yes, I do think that is part of how we address this topic. Maybe on the suggestion to either completely separate the E and the S, which I initially I think already addressed with my view that is probably not the way to go. The other solution to just have very strict exclusion standards, I think there needs to be a level where certain companies violate basic rights and should no longer be part of certain portfolios. But we do want to be extremely careful with setting hard lines on which companies meet that bar, because it is, as Belinda just mentioned, about the overall holistic view. And there are trade-offs that are not easy to manage by the companies. It's all good and well to sit here and say, oh, every company should do everything perfect. But if you just think about the ag sector, right? More sustainable ways of growing food often are just much more expensive at this point in time, and that has a direct effect on people that don't have enough possibilities to buy that food. So yes, this is what we promote. On the other hand, we're also trying to work with them to see how they can deliver at a acceptable cost to the market. So it is about engaging with these companies. We have active engagement programs around best practices in terms of providing minimum rights in terms of the Congo and the mining businesses, and often we learn a lot about the companies also in that process, and understand better that it's maybe not so easy as it sometimes looks from a room in the Western world to say, okay, just make sure that you get that done and everything will be fine. But these are trajectories that these companies need to go through. That said, it is really important, and that's why we're focusing so much on supply chain management, that the companies that are using the inputs in their end products, like the cobalt in the battery, that they put pressure on their providers, because they have the highest leverage often on these companies, right? And that is something that we can stimulate as investors in these companies.
Thanks, Martijn. So you're highlighting to engage to resolve some of these tensions. Juan, do you have something to add how Pictet is addressing the inherent potential tension?
Someone in the chat asked if there was a guidance on how to navigate situations.
Yes.
There isn't, unfortunately. I don't think there'll ever be one. But I echo what Belinda and Martijn have said. We have a very similar approach. Having said that, there are cases where it's just too challenging. We're still trying to find a way to get more comfortable with what companies tell us and how they seem to be managing this. But, you know, the elephant in the room being Xinjiang and how basically all these solar panels and cotton, that's all embedded, like fully embedded in global supply chains. Where do you even start? So again, we've started by raising the issue to the better extent that we can. But again, it's still very challenging, I must say. That doesn't mean that we should shy away with it. We should continue to push. But yeah, it's a big thing that I mean everyone is kind of grappling with.
Indeed. Thanks, Juan, for bringing that up. Of course, it affects, I think, over 90% of all solar panels, over 80% of cotton products produced in China come from the Xinjiang region, tomatoes. And with the labor transfer programs, there are even now doubts that products from anywhere else in China might not be tainted as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
By forced labor and discrimination of Uyghurs.
Yeah.
So it calls into question how to navigate China. And thanks for bringing this up, because I think this will be something that we will discuss for a long time to come.
Yeah.
Patricia, do you have something to add on the question in the chat? And I'm happy that there are questions coming in. Thanks for picking up the question on the guidance. You said there will never be one. Well, maybe there might be one eventually on specific issues. Is the ILO, the ILO is very good at putting out guidance. Is there anything in the pipeline or plans? Maybe particularly on child labor, because that's another question, and children's rights.
I'm also seeing the question here. I want to go back. And I also started off with trying to make a message very simple, and I'm trying to do it here again on this question. I think it is a mistake to separate E and S and G. We will never arrive anywhere if we do that. Why? Because they're all part of the sustainability agenda. As an example, if we are talking about the handling of toxic waste, obviously we have all three in here. On the E side, we have pollution. On the S side, we have the workers handling this toxic waste, and we have the communities who might be exposed to it. So it's a mistake to separate them. And that's why I'm repeating it here. It's a little bit similar when talking about exclusions. And thank you, Martijn, for bringing this topic up, because yeah, it sounds like an easy way out. We just exclude activities that involve forced and child labor. Why not? But it's not that simple. There's always a transition to somewhere. Exclusions are difficult because sometimes it is not even a missing willingness, but it is a missing capacity or missing knowledge that make companies engage in activities that are not very positive. I might sound a little bit too positive here, but when working with larger SMEs in Africa, this is often really the case. They need a hand. And I think this is what is actually needed to overcome also this tension. First, we need to see this all together, and we need to give a hand to the companies to actually do a transition to improve. And it's a bit of an utopia to think we will have a zero non-compliance company out there. There will always be something that can be improved. So that was the second point here. And the third point that I wanted to make, and I am getting to more of this guidance, is, and here we are kind of the converted. I think what we all need to do is we need to showcase business cases that tell everyone it works and it even makes business sense. So, and here is where I want to bring in an example, also that links a bit to the child labor side from Pakistan. Where we actually worked with a financial institution, and we did see, and they actually knew they had child labor among their client businesses, and they actively wanted to address it, which is great, but they didn't, and they tried many different things. Some of them worked, some of them less. So we tried with them to implement a new health insurance and accident insurance product. It sounds very little, it almost sounds like nothing. But what it managed to do was that it broke down the cycle of an adult member in the family working in the business, first of all, not working anymore, not earning money, children jumping in to replace those people to earn money, also to pay for additional medicine. So it's, one needs to understand why these things happen. And we actually did see that this reduced child labor and the likelihood of new children falling into child labor. So Dorothée, I'm sure from a research perspective, you like to hear this, but I think this is real. This, we saw this change happening, and this is at the end a business case.
Yes.
Because for the financial institution, the repayment rate was not negatively affected, but positively. Plus, they had a new product that they could actually even sell. And I think these are the things that we need to show out there. This can be done.
Yep.
And this was also a bit a link to the child labor one here on. I mean, our colleagues in ILO, there's a whole department called fundamentals that deal with the fundamental principles and rights of work. Of course, child labor, forced labor is one of them. And they have set out a lot of guidance. If you want to know more, just let me know. They have also, they are actually the Secretariat for an Alliance 8.7, SDGs, yes, this is linked to child labor 8.7, and it's an alliance that also includes the private sector. So if you do want guidance, you can also pick up this alliance, and there are a lot of private sector entities that are there. And a very last one, which is to the already going to this measurement and how can we overcome this tension? You might think I am a little bit too optimistic. Huh? I think when you have a purpose, and companies also have a purpose, and when you invest, if you invest with a purpose, this can really turn the needle. But you need to be sure what is the objective that you actually want to achieve. And then kind of put your theory of change behind that. And then you will realize very quickly you don't need 1,368 metrics behind that. Because not everything is relevant for that journey that you outline to actually achieve your purpose, your objective. But I think it's a necessary step, because only when this is clear, you are able to measure. And the measuring starts with, of course, the screening, and then putting conditions in place that you can accompany throughout an investment process and adjust when you see that you're not achieving a certain impact. That was my last point I wanted to make here.
Patricia, thanks. I think it's great that you pointed out that often respecting rights is just better business, and there might be a business case, and so it just makes good business sense to fully integrate the S. Also, your notion of invest with purpose. I want to transition to the thematic funds that are out there, and obviously climate funds dominate. But I would love to hear from Belinda what investment options your firm sees on issues like workplace or diversity issues and the so-called S-themed funds. How common are they? How effective are they? And what type of future do you see for them? Which themes do you think could be addressed through such S-themed funds?
Sure, lots of good questions in there. I think I might start just the comments to start with. You're right, there are lots of E-focused funds, and we can kind of come back to why that's the case. But in part, I think it is because the E is easier to measure. There seems to be a common focus on certain metrics, whether that be carbon emissions intensity, whereas I think it goes back to my point at the start in terms of S covers so many topics. Everyone understands the G, they understand the E, and S is almost everything else in between. Yeah. And so from that perspective, it depends on what S social issue that you're trying to measure, what you're focused on, and whether you can even get the data for that. On your point around funds, yes, there are some social funds. I think we've seen a number of, those focused on diversity and inclusion. I'd argue that something like, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's relevant for all companies. It's something we should be monitoring, engaging on across investments, rather than just having a single dedicated fund. And, I mentioned the data challenges. If we take something, the extension of DE and I, we are seeing better data on gender diversity, but typically, most of the focus is at the board level, not at every level of the organization. So at entry level, sort of middle in the workforce. And then that's just one element and dimension of diversity. So gender, what about ethnic and racial diversity? LGBTQ+, that data is much more challenging to come by. And then throw another one in there, gender pay gap data. Required by companies here in the UK to report, but not the same requirement globally. So we've covered some of the D and the E, and then if we move to the I, how do you actually measure inclusion in a consistent and comparable way across companies, sectors, and geographies? I hope that just gives you a sense of I've just taken D and I, one of the very many topics covered under the S umbrella, but you can see some of the challenges here. And why it perhaps is harder. I guess maybe finally on your question around effectiveness, to me, you really have to start with what is your objective in the first instance in order to be able to evaluate this. So are you trying to achieve a particular social objective? And can you find the appropriate data to measure that progress in a meaningful way over time? Is it a certain impact outcome that you're looking for, or just trying to advance and promote a social issue and agenda over time? Alternatively, your objective could be to outperform the broader market in financial returns terms by focusing on a specific theme. And so I think you really need to unpick, because it's a really, easy, it sounds seemingly easy, but I think, lots of different elements in there to say whether this is effective. And if you take, my latter point around financial returns, there have been, you can see, some diversity and inclusion funds have underperformed broader ESG funds. And we've seen that, particularly during COVID, and, we can debate sort of why that's the case, but I'd go back to the point that, there are certain issues, whether it's human rights, labour standards, human capital management, that are really important across all companies and sectors that you invest in. So wouldn't really focus on one over another. To argue that one social issue is far more important than another, I think is particularly challenging.
Belinda, thanks. I knew it. We cannot talk about the S in ESG without addressing and talking about these measurement challenges on both sides. The data challenges, first of all, defining the S, and then the data challenges of actually accessing good S data, but also defining effectiveness in this context. I think, I hope we'll have more time to discuss these measurement challenges in the session that we're hosting on October 5. But I would love to hear from Juan or Martijn. of one good example of an S-themed fund. How are they, in this specific example, address these measurement challenges? Just a concrete example from your context, if you have, Martijn.
Yeah. No, we have a perfect. I myself in 2018, we worked together with our wealth management colleagues to develop a gender equality fund. We came exactly to the same conclusion that everybody gets to who looks into this, that you get a lot of data on female representation on the board, and that's more or less where it stopped. And what we did is looked for a partner that was digging deeper on this topic, and we found that in a actually Dutch company, Equilab, that is doing due diligence on companies in terms of a much broader set of data related to gender equality, and looks at pay gaps, looks at how junior management is supported and flowing through senior management, and how percentages of female employees compare to male employees, looks at differences within sectors. So allowed us to get a much deeper view on that than we initially thought we could get. So 2 messages. First of all, the fund is now 1.6 billion. So anybody that says, well, with S, there is no commercial viability for a product, or it cannot be done, I think look again. 2 is you'll need to do probably additional work, right? So obviously at the time, this organization also didn't have all these fantastic processes in place, like the big data providers would probably be able to give to you, but we worked with them, and we think we found a very good way to get additional insights into the companies that we put into our portfolio, and that helps, and we need that, right? It's also a chicken and egg problem, right? Because there are not that many products, people are not familiar with it, and there's less measurement and less disclosure on these topics. So be creative and work hard, and sometimes you might succeed.
Martijn, thanks for instilling optimism.
If I may add to that, just very briefly, because Pictet as a house has been focusing on thematics for over 20 years, and we have this big franchise, and half of the offering is socially focused products on health, digital, security, food. But these were designed as thematic funds, not impact funds, if you will. But we acknowledge that the world has moved on, and we are working with external consultants and with these funds. All these funds have advisory boards to refine the theory of change of each fund, as Patricia was mentioning, and find impact objectives that we can meaningfully measure. It's hard. Yeah, it's hard, but we're working on it. It's probably going to be focused around access and how companies in these funds are working to sort of deal with inequalities through access. It's work in progress. Keep your eyes open, because it's not an easy task, but we're working on it.
One quick follow-up question to Martijn, because you earlier referred to engagement. Maybe you can comment briefly on how can engagement with companies resolve some of these measurement challenges as well. As you work with companies, you also better understand what the S is truly about, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a side effect of say developing these kind of products, looking for these measurement criteria that we deem relevant, and discussing with the companies why they're not disclosing that on a broader scale, right? And the interesting part is that often the companies are very interested in what we would be looking for, and are also willing and participating in creating the data, but somebody needs to tell them that investors appreciate that data, and then you come into the second circle, because we can start to then use that data to test how these companies are doing versus their peers that don't provide the data, or where we have data of a weaker quality, and that's a whole say business in itself, because it allows us, of course, to get an advantage in information, which is legal, on what we're actually looking for. So that I think engagement is an extremely important tool, because it facilitates this collaboration between companies understanding what we care about, and them providing that information that we can then use in our investment decision.
Martijn, that sounds fantastic, but I know that engagement is also very labor intense. May I ask, how big is your team? How many S experts do you have in your team for this type of engagement?
We have a very large team working on engagement with companies, right? So we have a dedicated sustainability team of almost 30 people that are day and night working on developing metrics, methodologies, and discussing with companies. But I think the actual value is of leveraging that in our investment activities. So having the analysts and the portfolio managers that talk to the companies, and where the CEOs and the CFOs are especially interested to make a good impression on them, talk about these metrics and how that influences their investment case and why they think it is important. So yes, you need a good expertise internal to do the research and create the frameworks. That is important. But I think a second step that is sometimes not always appreciated enough is to make sure that it really gets embedded with the investment process and the people making the decision on where the money flows. Right? It doesn't. It just isn't enough if some sustainability analyst says, okay, this would be interesting if you disclose that. It works much better if it's an integrated part, like in the product that we have, where we say, okay, if you don't meet these deadlines, then you cannot be part of this product, and that triggers the actual change in companies, we feel.
Yeah. Thanks, Martijn. I want to use the remainder of the time for the great questions in the chat. And one has come in from my NYU Stern colleague, Michael Goldhaber, which I want to read to you. I think it's for Patricia, who wisely advises to formulate a theory of change and then pick your metrics. Also relates to Belinda's comments on S can be 1,000 things. So it seems to me, Michael writes, that this is an argument for more focused investment, which is disintegration of a sort. So not necessarily disintegrating the E from the S, but focus holistically on one issue, say toxic waste, and measure both the E and the S aspects, but just pick toxic waste metrics and don't mix it with 1,000 other subtopics. Does this resolve the positive tension between holistic and disaggregated? Is this a way forward? Patricia, over to you. What do you think?
That is a nice one. So what I mean with formulating a theory of change would actually start off typically, what is a challenge that we want to address, and then formulate an intended change that we want to see. So if our formulated change here would be reduce production of toxic waste, then yes, that would hold through. But I don't know if you will have any investment that makes economic sense if you only focus on that goal. So I think in the formulation of the objective, we might need to be a bit broader. What the investment actually wants to achieve. And I'm sure there you also have the financial considerations coming in, because at the end, it all needs to make business case, at least in this community that we are here today. It all needs to make business case. And I fully support this, because if a financial service provider does not make money, the financial service provider is not there tomorrow. And this is even worse, because all these people that entrusted the money in the sector will be even worse off. And who are those people that entrust money? So now I put my ILO hat on again. This is also workers. So the financial sector does need to make money. But still, this is part of sustainable finance. The sustainable development objectives need to come across. So I do like your logic, Michael, there. I would just formulate it a bit broader. And perhaps if you allow me, Dorothée, to add on, because I think I hear this also a bit, yeah, but what are these metrics, and are there 1,000 or whatever metrics? So once you kind of know a bit the theme, and I know I'm talking not only of a subset of the sector here. I think 1 year ago, we worked with the Global Impact Investing Network on shaping investment strategies for quality jobs. So that could be kind of a theme, quality jobs, and we came up with 5 investment strategies, and also put metrics behind. So I think there is a lot out there. Once you know what that theme is, you can go to these resources and just extract and then use them. Yes, there is a lot out there, but if you find the right entry point with that purpose, with that formulation, I think this is all fine. And one last word I want to add. What we often see is checklists. Oh, I love checklists. Checklist question. Does your company comply with local labor regulation? Check boxes. Yes, no. We check yes. And then we are fine in our screening. No, we are not, because we need to get verification of that answer. We need to ask what is underlying that. And at least we need to see a payroll, and we need to see some HR policies, and we need to see some contract templates. So it's this, for the measurement, it's also this verification part that is super important, that comes also at cost. And I like what Martijn said. It needs to be integrated in the investment process, and the investment advisors, they need to be capacitated to actually do it. And then it doesn't stay somewhere in the ivory tower with the sustainability team. Then it becomes real, because those people can also report back what works and what just doesn't work. And then we can adjust.
Thanks, Patricia. Belinda, I'd love to hear from you again, because it also related to your comment. First of all, on the question and on Patricia's comments, what would you say?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, what Patricia was saying and Michael's take, because if I were to sit it again, if we pick up on that toxic waste example, and, we just were to focus on that, if it feels like, if you had the opportunity to engage with a company on that, but you could see other areas of improvement, whether that be diversity, whether that be on sort of how employee well-being and everything else that, other S issues, it feels like a missed opportunity to not engage and help improve. I think if we think about companies, and we all want to sort of move towards ESG best practice and to do what they're doing in a better way that minimizes impact, because we think ultimately that'll be good for their long-term value. Why wouldn't you, focus on an important topic, but also try and address others that are material as well? So again, I come back to the holistic point of view, not just to focus on one, but look at everything across the company, look at what is, right for their circumstances in terms of best practice. So obviously that's going to be on the individual, for companies in certain sectors, but also their geographic and emerging market versus, a developed market company. It's going to have a different context, and I think we need to be conscious of that. So yeah, I'm still very much in the camp of a holistic point of view, though recognizing there are certain topics that you may want to at times focus on and provide, I guess, put more emphasis on in conversations with management. Yeah.
Thanks, Belinda. Jafar Abeid Kamolegay, I hope I pronounce your name correctly, asks very specifically, would forced migration, according to you, fall under the S in ESG? Martijn or Juan, one of you maybe, is that something you've looked into before?
I would definitely put it as part of a social factor, right? But we typically then discriminate between what are on a government level social changes or challenges that need to be addressed versus what are on a company level, and part of that is inclusion, right? So like we've seen now in the Ukraine crisis, there can be a clear role for the corporate community to also play its part in there, and that's also what we would like to see of the companies that we invest in. But this would typically be looked at in the context of sustainability of sovereigns, which is a whole world in itself. Again.
If I may add briefly, I think the way we've sort of looked at it is more on the implications of forced migration for the labor market, and specifically on issues around modern slavery and how that can be linked to the modern slavery issue. So we're looking at it from that angle.
Okay. Yeah. Right. We're almost at the hour, and I want to wrap this up on time, but there is such a timely question still in the chat, because it was certainly all over my Twitter feed today, the decision of Patagonia to sell the company to the planet. Does one of you want to comment on this? Is this the future?
It's great that he decided to do that, but it's a private company, right? When you're dealing with a publicly listed company, it's a whole different ballgame, and yeah, I don't want to say anything that's never going to happen, because we never know. But yeah,
you wanted to avoid becoming a public company, essentially.
Yeah. And shareholders are not an easy bunch.
Yes. Any other comments on this specific case? It's making quite some waves today. It's quite radically outside of typical strategies. So
perhaps, Dorothée, one thing, what we need is innovation. And this is something innovative. Why not trying it? So there are probably a million other innovations that can be done. But only through that we learn. So perhaps that's my takeaway from it. I was also surprised. I still haven't fully made up my mind about the substance, but on this, it's an innovation. Let's try.
Thanks. I actually like this as a final word, but if someone else has a final comment, I don't want to cut you off. So is there something else you'd like to say before we thank everyone and wrap this up? All good? There's a lot more to discuss on this topic, and I really enjoyed our conversation. I thank all panelists and also the audience for your great interest in this topic. I think it's a topic for the future, more to be defined and innovated on, Patricia. And I look forward to continuing this conversation, potentially with all of you on October 5 or at another occasion. I thank you very much and wish you a good evening. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.